when we could be having a way to make sure that our family members get the education they need to get a job and move forward in their lives. Hello, welcome to Conversation with Your Congressman. I'm your Congressman, John Tierney. Pleased to be here for this particular show with a terrific guest. Our friend is Professor Stephen Teret, who's from Johns Hopkins University. And I was just telling the professor I'm not going to read his entire bio because we only have a 28, 30-minute show on that, but it's obviously substantial. He is the Associate Dean for Education and Faculty Development at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and Professor of Health Policy and Management and Director of Johns Hopkins Center for Law and Public Health, and more and more and more. But for our purposes here today, Professor Teret has worked on the issue of guns and public health since at least 1979. You can date yourself back further if you want on that basis. But he's advised attorneys general, he's advised Congress, he's advised the president on this. And I do say that when we did recent legislation, he was the incentive of an article that he had written in a publication, Reducing Gun Violence in America, Informing Policy with Evidence and Analysis. It was edited by Daniel Webster and John Vernick, forwarded by Michael Bloomberg, but a great article in it by Professor Teret got us to thinking in our office, why can't we do something that's going to make it safe, particularly for younger people and families on that. And so in this environment, we tried to move the discussion a little bit in that direction. Tell us why gun violence or gun safety is a public health issue, Professor.
Well, there are lots of ways to describe gun violence and the consequences of gun violence, but it's killing more than 31,000 people every year in the United States. The financial cost of gun violence is just staggering if you trace out the cost over the lifetime of a person who's been injured or the death that results from gun violence. For some segments of our population, particularly young African-American males, it's the number one cause of death, not just the number one injury cause of death, but the number one cause of death overall. So it's hard to imagine anyone arguing that it's not a public health problem.
What role did handguns play in the overall theory of gun violence?
Handguns are the predominant product that's used for murders that occur in the United States. At least half of those murders are with a handgun. There are others that are with a long gun, a shotgun, or a rifle. But handguns figure most prominently, certainly for suicides. And actually, there are more suicide gun deaths in the United States than there are homicide gun deaths. But also for accidental or unintended gun deaths, handguns again figure most prominently.
I broke out some of the numbers that I saw in the collection of essays here, and I think it was over 31,672
yes.
gun deaths in 2010. 61% were suicides? Does
yes.
that sound right?
Yes.
61% of that suicides and 35% homicide.
Yes, that's right.
And then the balance, unintentional or accidental on that, which is almost well over 600 a year on that.
Yeah,
base.
Fortunately, the unintended or accidental are a small slice of the overall pie, if you did a pie chart of gun deaths, but they're particularly tragic deaths, especially when they involve young children, and so many of them do involve young children. The way that I first got into the area of gun violence was having heard the story of some friends of my wife's and mine whose 2-year-old was so sadly killed by a 4-year-old with a handgun. 4-year-old didn't know what he was doing. He probably didn't understand what a handgun is, but he pulled the trigger and this little boy was killed. When you read about those kinds of things in newspapers, you read about them as freak accidents. But what we learn in public health is there's what we call an epidemiology to these deaths. They occur over and over again. There are high-risk age groups, there are high-risk times at which this happens, and there are high-risk guns, and those are handguns.
So is this the incident, the one you're talking about, that got you first interested in focusing on this area of public health and guns?
Yes, it is. I was working in the field of injury prevention in general, and most people at the time were working in motor vehicle related injuries, which are very important and still are. But I decided to work in gun violence prevention. It's interesting if you look at the success that we've had with motor vehicle injuries. When I started in public health, there were about 52,000 deaths per year on the highway. Now they're 32,000, and as you said, there are 31,600 gun deaths. My expectation is that soon there'll be more gun deaths in the United States than motor vehicle deaths.
You know, Anne Marie Crowell was a guest of mine at the State of the Union address this year,
Yes.
Because she had a compelling and very sad story as well. She had a 12-year-old son in Saugus, Massachusetts, and he went on Christmas Eve, crossed the lawn to a neighbor's house, his 14-year-old friend, and they were talking and playing, and the young Crowell lad took a phone call from his sister telling him to get home for the Christmas Eve party they were having. The friend had found his mother's gun, which he had for safety on that. She legally owned it or whatever, but he had found it, and he was showing Anne Marie's son this gun, and it click, 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 and it went off, and it shot him in the neck, and he ended up dying. And
Yes.
she's very brave. She goes and she shares that story and allows us to share it. But the fact is that you can have a lawfully owned weapon. It can be registered. You can be somebody that's suitable to have the gun or whatever, and it can still result in accidental death
Yes.
or suicidal death in a grade. And it happens more frequently, obviously, than it ought to. And so we're trying to look at different things. What I want to broach a little bit before I get into the personalized handgun thing, which I do want to talk about, a bill that we did, the scope of the Second Amendment. You know, we always have this debate that goes on and on that about whether or not there's a right for a person to own and possess a gun and to carry one. And I think that's been decided. The Heller case down here in Washington, D.C. decided that very clearly, but it is not an unlimited right. And so the court went through the history of all the limitations that have been put on handguns and said that wasn't exhaustive. But we have a hard time getting people to focus on that. I mean, some people want no restrictions at all. They see every time that somebody tries to limit that ownership or possession of handguns is sort of a nose under the tent with a camel and going on.
Yes.
But the court talked about there being a type of weapon being one of the considerations. Is it commonly used? Is it extraordinarily or unreasonably dangerous? Individual that might own it, are they a danger to themselves or to others? Do they have a past violent criminal record? Do they have a past violent emotional situation on that? Places where you may or may not want certain types of weapons or any weapon to be involved on that. So, we understand that, but in looking at this, we thought, if we could do something about making the instrument itself safer, particularly handguns with such high incident, that might be the idea on that. And, we worked on that. Again, I stole some of the ideas from your publication on that, and you've been great in working with us. But we have a Personalized Handgun Safety Act, which
Yes.
we've put out there on that. I'm going to leave it to you to tell some of the ideas behind that, and then I'll fill it in with the detail of the actual bill.
Well, going back to what you said just a moment ago, I think the Heller case, which is the one that interpreted the Second Amendment, saying that there is an individual right to own some guns, or at least for some people to own some guns, did us all a great service. It put an end to a debate that was raging for more than 100 years. But it also made clear, as you say, that it's not an unlimited right. It's not that any person can own any kind of firearm or carry any kind of firearm in any place. We have reasonable limitations. It's the job of the courts now to define more clearly what those limitations are. But one of the limitations should not be something that prevents us from having safer guns. We have a history of making products safer in the United States to our great advantage. We've averted countless deaths by making cars safer, by making all kinds of consumer products safer. We need to make the same thing about guns. We need to make them safer. When I heard the story that I mentioned before about this young boy, as a public health person, one of the first thoughts I had is, why would anyone make a handgun that's operable by a 4-year-old? We're smart enough that we make aspirin bottles that aren't operable by 4-year-olds. Nobody wants to see a 4-year-old to be able to pick up a gun and shoot it. I know that you're aware of the fact that recently a young child in, I think it was Tennessee, picked up a gun that belonged to a sheriff or a deputy sheriff, someone who's trained in gun safety, and the young child was able to discharge the gun and the wife of the sheriff sadly was killed as a result of that. That we shouldn't be making guns that a 2-year-old, that a 4-year-old can operate, and it's simple to make them so they're inoperable by unauthorized people. The technology has existed for a long time. It's gotten a lot better in recent years, but this is not a technology that we hope for. It exists now. There are guns being made in Europe now that are personalized, so only the authorized person can discharge the gun, and we need to do that in the United States, and your bill will help us in doing that.
It's amazingly that somewhere along the line, the National Rifle Association or others who used to be in favor of safe ownership,
Yes.
who fought against machine guns back in the 1930s, and it used to give it used to be about teaching people how to safely use a gun, be against overly dangerous weapons, things of that nature. Now they've sort of come full cycle on this, and they don't want to get engaged in the conversation of proper limitations on that. So they're really driving a force the other way on that. But they also have worked it out so that no gun manufacturer can be held liable for a defective weapon. So we set standards, as you said, for everything from toys, toy guns or other toys, to automobiles, and people are responsible if they're negligent and don't keep that product in a safe way, but the gun manufacturers aren't held to that. There's a history here, where back when President Clinton was in office, there were grants that were given out and for manufacturers who had a couple of manufacturers had $300,000 grants to develop this technology further.
Yes.
And it looks as if what they did was they put it on the shelf.
Yes.
You familiar with that?
I had the honor of being able to work with President Clinton on that, and I'm quite familiar with what happened, and you're exactly right that some of the major gun manufacturers in the United States moved the technology forward significantly to a point where we were ready to be able to market those guns. But sadly, those manufacturers were told by outside pro-gun forces that if they did that, they would be stepping outside of the family of gun people and that they would be punished. And in fact, there was a particular manufacturer whose product was boycotted when the manufacturer made a promise to the people of the United States that it was going to make a safer gun. So the pro-gun forces, of course, play hardball in this area.
Do you ever get a rationale that satisfied you as to why they thought it was important to stop that kind of technology from being incorporated in handguns?
Well, I didn't get a rationale from the National Rifle Association or anyone else, but what I believe is their rationale, which is not rational in my mind, is that, as you were saying, it's the nose of the camel under the tent. It's the first way that guns would be regulated, and it would be an enormous success because we would see some of these gun deaths come down in numbers, and they don't want gun regulation to be a success story.
But the current state of technology is pretty impressive. I've heard since we started working on this, obviously for your good work and people that you were able to talk to us about, and the state of technology is really there. I've had visits from people from Germany, from California, from New Jersey,
Yes.
Others, all who are developing this technology, and it's there, it exists. One of the pushbacks that so-called gun advocates or limitations advocates on that is they want to make people believe that this technology is too futuristic, it'll never happen, the gun won't be able to be used properly, whatever, none of which is true. Is that correct?
Yes, President Obama, in his executive orders that he issued in mid-January, had one executive order that said that the National Institute of Justice and the Department of Justice should do an assessment of the current technology, and that's taking place right now. My understanding is that their report will be released within the next few months. But I've seen these new guns. I've seen how they operate. Thankfully, there's not just one technology, and this is excellent, that there are a number of technologies from which people can choose. But these technologies make guns more reliable than they have been in the past. It's interesting with handguns that we make and we sell handguns now the same way that they were made a century ago. There aren't that many products that you could find in the United States now that have not had electronics introduced into them. When electronics get introduced in guns, the gun is going to become more reliable rather than less reliable. we rely on electronic products all the time. I have a new car now, and all I have to do is keep the key in my pocket,
Exactly.
and I can open the door and start the engine without even putting a key in. These kinds of technologies, once they get into handguns, are going to be a benefit to people who enjoy the use of handguns.
I was visited by one company that has the prospect of having a band or a watch band or a band on your wrist that
Yes.
technologically allows the gun to be discharged, and you can set how many hours you want it to be operative, so that if you're a police officer, for instance, you're on duty for 6 hours or 8 hours, you put it in for that amount. As long as you have that band on, and you can discharge the gun, but if somebody steals the gun from the officer, it can't be used.
Right.
Unauthorized user. Anyway, about 17% of the law enforcement officers' deaths are the result of somebody taking their gun and
Yes.
using it against them. So that technology was put as interesting. Others have rings technology on that. I've heard from folks that have the palm print
Yes.
on that, and they're making hand grips.
Right.
That are there, and you can put more than one authorized user on a gun. That's the other contention of people is, oh my God, what if I want to let my wife fire my gun, or if I'm at a club and people are over there sharing with her
Sure.
like that. But that, as you say, with electronics, that's not an insurmountable goal at all.
You could have 20 people who are authorized
Exactly,
to use a gun.
and just as long as it's authorized, somebody that can, but unauthorized users can't. So the state of the art is really impressive and has moved along on this basis. Some people have told me they want to have this be on a voluntary basis. I see no voluntary effort from the National Rifle Association of gun manufacturers to step forward and get into this market. I was told by one manufacturer that they had originally sold their technology, and the company they sold it to just put it on the shelf.
Yes.
They had to sue to get the technology back, and
Yes.
now they only license it out. They will not sell it anymore. They will license it out because they're afraid that was the path that people were going. Have you seen evidence of that?
Yes, I have, and you're right. There's nothing to indicate in the history of gun manufacturing that the gun manufacturers are going to voluntarily make their products safer. They're not going to voluntarily use existing technologies, so we need to give them incentives to do that.
Right. And when it says they have absolutely no liability for anything that they do or don't do right now, it's a wide open field for them.
Well, that's the pill that's hardest to swallow, in that we don't regulate the safety of guns. One might think that the Consumer Product Safety Commission would regulate guns because guns are a consumer product, but Congress, because of the influence of the National Rifle Association, decades ago, Congress told CPSC, Consumer Product Safety Commission, that they have no jurisdiction over guns or ammunition. So then you might think that, well, we'll do something legislatively, but as you know far better than I do, there are disincentives for that. So the last possible solution, we thought, was, okay, we'll turn to the third branch of government, the judiciary, and if someone is injured because of a gun that's not made as safely as possible, we'll bring a lawsuit against the manufacturer, just as we bring a lawsuit against a car that's improperly made that doesn't use safety devices. But as you mentioned, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which was signed into law several years ago, in most situations provides immunity to the gun manufacturers from liability. So all of our avenues have been halted. Progress on that have been halted, which is why it's so important that you've introduced your
Enter
bill.
the Personalized Handgun Safety Act.
Exactly.
And this is exactly where we focus on this. So we want to personalize the weapon. All right, the technology exists. It can be done. Only authorized users should be able to fire or discharge any handgun on that basis. And again, multiple users that are authorized will be able to do that. We provide grants to the National Institute of Justice so that they continue the research and development of the technology and allow that to happen. And we allow the Consumer Protection Safety Commission to actually set a standard.
Yes.
What will be the safety standard for a personalized handgun, and do it. We actually give, I think, probably more time than is necessary. We give another 2 years for the further development of technology. It exists today, but we'll let it take another 2 years or so to do that. And for the Consumer Protection Safety Commission, they hear from people, whether it's law enforcement or other manufacturers or people, to develop the right safety standard for that. After that point, manufacturers will have to produce a gun that meets that standard of personalization. And if they don't, then they're going to be held liable. If they do, then they're fine. And that's, I think, the driving force on that. And we've seen it, as I said, the history before on that. This is a fairly simple act, and hopefully people will be able to distinguish between taking away somebody's gun and actually doing them the benefit of making their gun safer.
Yes.
I think there's a market out there for people that, I've already heard at least one story of somebody who said to me, look, I've always wanted to have a gun in the house for personal safety and protect my family like that, but I've been scared to death to have it because I got kids.
Right.
And this, may be a way for that person to say, all right, I'm going to have a gun, but it's going to be a safe gun, and I feel more comfortable on that basis. I know law enforcement officers, we've got support from police officers, from the mayors, Bloomberg and Menino, that group
Yes.
on that, from district attorneys, from John Rosenthal's groups, Stop Handgun Violence Now, from the Children's Defense Act, from the Moms Demand Action for for gun sense. It's been really widely accepted by people who understand that, all right, the handguns are out there and people have a right to own them or whatever, but why can't they be safe?
Well, I'm here to tell you today that the public health community, and more particularly the gun violence prevention community, are extraordinarily grateful to you for your leadership in bringing this act to the attention of the American public. This is something that's doable. Lots of times you hear people say, well, this is just common sense legislation. This is truly common sense legislation, and lives are going to be saved by your bill. And thank you very much.
I don't often plug different people on this, but I do want to say Joe Nocera from the New York Times.
Yes.
He mentioned this bill once on a show on that or whatever, which I appreciate. We do have to get people to understand what's going on. But he's been running a blog, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yes.
And I wish people would follow that blog. And every time they see one of his blogs reporting that some young child or some person that may be a little older or whatever has been killed with a handgun unnecessarily, that could have been prevented by having personalized handgun users, will think about, why don't I call my representative, why don't I call somebody on this thing and say, like, look, we've got to really move that bill and we've got to do something on it, because the numbers are astronomical. You're not taking away anybody's right. It is not a slippery slope situation on that.
Right.
If all these manufacturers moving out there, I think one of the simplest things would be, once we get the standard set by the Consumer Commission on that, I can see a lot of public law enforcement people and others making contractual purchases, and actually that's business for the handguns. Maybe that will drive them as well.
Yes. I think the time has finally come. I've been waiting for this for 30 years, so I couldn't be happier with the introduction of your bill. But I think in several years to come, people will look back and they'll be puzzled. Why is it that we allowed guns to be made that when the gun is stolen from a home, and that happens between 350,000 and 500,000 times a year in the United States, that the criminal is able to use that gun? Why was it that we made guns that depressed teenagers could pick up and take their own lives? And why is it that we made guns that little kids find a gun and a playmate or a sibling is dead shortly thereafter? It makes no sense.
When you think over a third of the deaths in 2010, over a third of the over 31,000 deaths were suicides.
Yes.
And a large portion of those are 15 to 19-year-olds, 15 to 24-year-olds on that.
Yes. Now, some people would say, well, those people would just find a different way of committing suicide, but we have data that shows that that's not true.
I was going to say, that's absolutely not true from all the data that we've seen.
Right. So they don't have a substituted means. And the second reason is there's nothing as lethal as a gunshot to the head. Someone takes an overdose of pills, they can help that person in the emergency department. If someone shoots himself, a depressed teenager or a temporarily depressed teenager shoots himself or herself in the head, there's not much that emergency medicine can do for that person.
The number of studies that I've seen which indicate that even a momentary distraction of somebody who seems intent on doing themselves harm, if something can just come between them and that intent momentarily, it's enough in many, many cases to just turn that around and allow for the person to get help, or not happen on that occasion, and things evolve from that situation. So
Yes.
There's every reason in the world to move on this. Why we're the last country standing, to do sensible things always sort of it just boggles the mind on that basis. But we have it in the publication I was talking about. There's a whole section on what other countries have done about gun safety and violence prevention on that. And you're familiar,
Yes.
I think, with a little bit of that. We have Great Britain, Australia, Brazil,
Yes.
even on that. Talk a little bit about the fact that other countries are out in front on this issue and maybe some of what
Well,
they've done?
unfortunately for us, other countries are ahead of us in approaching the problem. In Australia in the mid-1990s, there was a horrible incident in which a young man with assault weapons killed 30 or so people at Port Arthur, and Australia's response was almost immediate. They banned assault weapons, long guns that were assault weapons. Not only did they ban them, but they gathered them up and they destroyed them. About 1 million guns were destroyed. Since that time, since the law went into effect in the late 1990s, there has never been another mass gunslaying in Australia. So there are effective ways of dealing with the problem.
The Prime Minister who was in office at that time made an interesting point that they don't have an organization as strong as the National Rifle Association push back on, but he did have the problem of having to get every one of the regions of his country to independently buy into that concept. He couldn't just nationally take the action. Right. But the sentiment was so strong in that country, he had the threat of nationalizing it by going to a referendum to change their constitution to let it become nationally regulated on that. And people thought so strongly that would happen that they all drove to a solution on that. You wonder what it's going to take in this country to get people upset enough about this, to realize that we can do something about this, so to drive the public opinion and push back. I think we're going to see that. I think they're going to bring forward the background check, which is a rather simple process on that. And I hope a part of it is going to be here with the personalization of the handgun safety on that. I'm appreciative for all the work that you've done on this issue for so long on that, but that you've made yourself so readily available to us. I mean, I can't believe sometimes we're so fortunate in this job to get really smart people who are really dedicated to an issue like yourself to step forward and give us your time. I know what a busy schedule you have on that, so I thank you for that, and I give you a little less than a minute for a parting shot if you want to tell our audience anything.
Well, it's my great pleasure to be here to talk with you about it, and you should not be thanking me. I should be thanking you, and I am thanking you again, not just on my own, but on behalf of all public health, on behalf of all Americans, for making us a safer country by introducing legislation such as the one that you have.
Well, now we're going to call on everybody in our district and around the country to help us get behind this and move it. It's so simple and so much common sense on that. We're looking forward to do it. Again, thank you, and thank everybody for tuning in and watching this.
Thank you.